Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Humanities for the Public Good Symposium. My name is Ashley Melzer. I am Director of Humanities for the Public Good, and I have the pleasure of introducing this session. We are so excited for today's conversation and to field questions from the audience, so if you have questions, please post them in the chat. In case you aren't already aware, our host for this week is really Humanities for the Public Good, which is an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation funded initiative that works to connect scholars and communities within and beyond UNC Chapel Hill. Before we get started, we feel that it's important as stewards of public engagement to acknowledge that the Triangle overlaps with the historic territories of Siouan, Iroquois, and Algonquin indigenous communities. Today, their descendants belong to sovereign nations that continue to resist systematic erasure. So let us honor them whose land we are on, and the enslaved people whose labor built the wealth and laid the foundation of this university. We recognize the persistent realities of that history, and we invite you to work beside us to create change. For today's conversation, we're really excited to welcome our featured guest, Dr. Patricia Parker and Shawanna Sykes. Dr. Patricia Parker is chair of the Department of Communication, where she is a professor of critical organizational communication studies and the director of the Graduate Certificate in Participatory Research. Professor Parker's research, teaching, and engaged scholarship focus on social justice leadership and decolonizing organizational communication process. She is co-editor with Larry Frey of the University of California Press book series, Communication and Social Justice Activism. Please welcome Dr. Parker. We also are really proud to welcome Shawanna Sykes. Shawanna is a licensed career and technical educator. She graduated from East Chapel Hill High School and attended North Carolina Agriculture and Technical State University. While at A&T, she studied and earned her degree in Family Consumer Science Education, grades 6 through 12. She's been a CTE teacher for over 7 years. In her free time, she enjoys servicing hair clients, participating in community service events, and spending time with family and friends. Shawanna is an Ella Baker Women's Center board member and one of the original participants of that program as a teen. Please welcome Shawanna Sykes.
Thank you, Ashley, so much for that warm welcome.
Yes, thank you. It was such a great opportunity. Well, it's such a great opportunity being part of the work and just looking at it and reflecting on the work that we did as a teen. And now that I'm an adult, it's just such a great opportunity.
Well, I'm so happy, Shawanna, to be in this conversation with you this evening. So I am going to start by giving a brief overview of the book. This is actually I believe it's my first book talk for this book, Ella Baker's Catalytic Leadership, a primer on communication and social justice leadership and communication for social justice. And so I'm going to give an overview. This is a book that is it's based on a case study. That was grounded in this work of a small collective of African-American teen girls and their parents, university faculty, students, and community activists who were learning leadership in the spirit of Ella Baker. And I'll talk a bit about that in a moment, but I had been inspired by Ella Baker prior to this, and this was in 2007. So this was an organic process in which this collective gathered, and so we were in this community. And so our collective social justice work takes place in what I call College Town, which is a fictionalized name used to signify the racialized spaces where historically white universities are situated and are near, often in or near historically Black communities. And those racial dynamics are manifested in the over-policing of Black bodies and persistent inequities in health, education, housing, and employment. And so for this case study, I really wanted to think about how people like me as an academic enter into communities as Ms. Baker did throughout her decades of anti-racist activist work and community organizing, you know, from a communication perspective, right? How do we communicate in ways that signify particular commitments that Ms. Baker illustrated in her, what I came to understand as a catalytic leadership approach. And so I hope people will get the book and they will be able to see that there are three main areas that I think about in terms of engaging, doing community engagement. That's entering communities, engaging in terms of this commitment to a group-centered leadership that Ms. Baker followed, and then catalyzing community-based collaboration. And so with each of those, in each of those areas, I provide a communication practices that I hope that will inspire others to follow the example that I feel like we've presented in this book. So now I want to read a brief excerpt because I want to give our listeners just an introduction to Ella Baker and a sort of a brief excerpt from the book. So I want to start by reading from the introduction of the book, and this is where I introduce Ms. Baker. And I will say, part of I was heavily influenced by historians, Barbara Ransby and Charles Payne, who did wonderful work. And by now there have been many books that have written about Ms. Baker. And I also went to the archives to learn more about her work at the Schomburg Center for Black Culture. So I'll read now. Ella Josephine Baker was a civil rights and human rights activist whose career as a behind-the-scenes organizer spanned more than 50 years. Her legacy continues to inspire social justice activists around the world to become carriers of the struggle for freedom, perhaps infusing with new meanings given the context of the time. For Ms. Baker, inspiration came from her childhood experiences growing up in a tight-knit Black community, only one generation from the end of institutionalized slavery in the United States. She was born in Norfolk, Virginia, but raised from age 7 in rural Littleton, North Carolina, near the area where both sets of her grandparents had been enslaved. She grew up hearing their stories of struggle and suffering, as well as how they fought back and resisted whenever possible to preserve their dignity. She also heard stories of their belief in self-determination and support for the betterment of the community. As the historian Barbara Ransby has observed, that class distinctions in Ella Baker's family helped shape her consciousness about class. Ella Baker came to believe that, as her grandparents and parents had taught, that those in a position to help others had a duty to do so. But she also believed that those in elite positions should, and this is a quote from Ransby, should humble themselves in order to create the social space necessary for the more oppressed people in the community to speak and act on their own behalf. And over time, Ms. Baker continued to hone this thinking into a radical vision for participative democracy as she allied herself with poor and oppressed people working to change unjust systems. And she also developed from this background an analysis of gender, where gender roles were also challenged in Baker's community, providing a foundation for her to confront the sexist norms she later encountered in the male-dominated early and mid-20th century change organizations. And so I read that excerpt to give this context about Ella Baker's influence the influences on her leadership, and how she come to be a conduit through which the legacy of Black resistance and transformative change processes were passed from her generation to future ones. And so this book tells the story of some of the early 21st century, we started in 2007, conduits of Ella Baker's philosophy, including Shawanna's as a part of that work. And this book is also about the limits and possibilities of alliances with people like me, as an African-American woman with a PhD, a university researcher, a tenured professor, who, I thought that, I think that I also relate to the people that I'm in community with, but there are things about, the distinctions that also make it a challenging proposition to think about partnering, being in partnership and community with people. So this is a book about how, someone like me can come into a community to support social justice leadership.
Thank you for that, Dr. Parker. Could you tell us what you hope to accomplish from this work?
Thank you. Yes, that's a great question. It's a great question because it gives me an opportunity to talk more about, how I understand Ella Baker as a role model. Ella Baker was what's sometimes called in the literature a bridge leader. Someone who can bridge, make connections among people who are sometimes marginalized because of the flows of power and the way that works in within and around communities. And so I wanted to try to replicate her approach. And for me, that involved trying to, working along with the collective of the wonderful activists who are in community and in the parents who worked alongside me, the students and so forth. We wanted to create this space for girls to see their own power. And I had spent a year before we starting this work studying biographies of Miss Baker. And that was one of the things that stood out, that she had this capacity. I talk about radical listening to silences and being able to step back and to creating that space where people can see their own power. Two students in particular, I just have to mention Joaquin Sanchez Jr. and Elisa Oseguera, who were summer interns in 2007. And they were so excited to join in this work and to develop workshops based on Ella Baker's idea of creating this participative space. So what I wanted to accomplish was to create that space for connections, where girls see their own power and be able to lead social change. And I have to tell you, if I ask, did we accomplish at least that part? I think maybe you might be a testament to that, Shawanna, because I want to share my favorite memory of your partnership in this work. I have this favorite memory. I remember on one of our trips, we were always trying to go to network with other youth, as Ms. Baker did, was always connecting folks. And we went to Chicago. This was for the Ella's Daughters Conference that Barbara Ransby actually had organized. And I remember walking in downtown Chicago by what people refer to as the big silver bean, that sculpture. And I just remember walking down the street and you twirled and you were thinking about, I don't know what you were thinking about, but it made me think about, and you totally probably wouldn't know anything about this, but Oprah talks about every girl was thinking about Mary Tyler Moore being out there twirling her, but somehow it was so empowering to see you twirling. I don't know what Mary Tyler Moore was thinking or Oprah, but for me, watching you twirl there, it seemed to epitomize sort of what the work we were doing. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. I remember twirling and feeling free. And I remember going to some of the workshops with other youth organizations. I definitely remember that event, that trip.
Yes, in Chicago. And then we went to New York. This was, I think, after you were in college and you came back as a chaperone for some of the other girls. And we were able to go to Harlem and see some of the places where Miss Baker had lived and worked and done her activism, but also connect with youth groups there. That was when we were working on the Raise the Age campaign, where at the time, New York and North Carolina were the only two states in the union that still locked up 16 and 17-year-olds in adult jails. And so we were working on that, and there was some fierce activism going on in New York with youth there, and we were able to learn from them and come back and do that work here.
Yes, I definitely remember those. It was nice having those experiences and just getting an opportunity to have a space where I felt comfortable enough to have those discussions with other youth that were in the same place as me. So those were all great moments that I remember.
So, yesterday we were talking about, you had asked me about what made me, write this book when we were kind of getting ready for our conversation. And we talked about, the fact that, trips like going to New York and also there was a conference that we created a conference. We had many projects, lots of places where we were sharing the work. But you asked me, like, when did you decide to write this book, and also what was the writing process like? And I've been thinking about that since you asked me that. First, let me just say that, from the very beginning, I knew that I wanted to be able to document what I was learning about being in community with people and working for social justice. And so I knew I wanted to write a book. I knew that there was, I had originally thought that the book would be Ella's Daughters, that would be all about the girls, and the girls somehow would co-author the book or something like that. But the more I did the work, and the more there were so many lessons. I mean, this book, one of the things about this book is I'm very vulnerable in this book in terms of the way I write myself, some of the mistakes that I made in terms of trying to follow Miss Baker's model, to follow the way that I saw that her being in community and seeing, in some ways failing, but failing in a way that, staying in community. I knew I wanted to be there for the long haul. So the more I stayed in the work, and this book recounts the first 6 years of the Ella Baker Women's Center, the more I knew that I wanted to write a book about the lessons that I had learned about being in community and organizing in the spirit of Ella Baker. So I can't say when I decided to write this book. It was probably in 2014 or so when I finally settled on that this was going to be about those lessons learned. But that would be the answer to that question. But ultimately, I knew it was going to be about this book, about, the lessons learned.
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Why don't you read us another selection?
All right. Well, I think I'll read a section that starts on page 83. And I have to do a little setup. I talked about some of the missteps and learning those lessons. And so I'm going to read this section that's about the first ever visit to the neighborhood by the local police chief. This was something that was a lead up to our collective's second project after the first one had failed. In the book, I talk about this was referred to as the dumpster project, this project that I'm going to talk about that inspired the police chief's visit to the neighborhood was a community festival that had been the girls' ideas, and actually, Shawanna, I think this was before you had been a part of the group, and so the original cohort. That had started, with the Ella Baker Women's Center back in 2007 and 8. We had started with that dumpster project, failed miserably, and people can talk about that. You can read about that in the book. But the girls had wanted, at one of our first workshops, they were like, let's have a party. And somehow that didn't get taken up. But in the end, after we went through some other processes, we did land on having a party, and we came up with this idea, the girls did, of having a community festival. And so they had taken charge and ultimately got the whole community involved. But we had an interesting start as we were planning this. And so I'll read the section that starts on page 83. In late August, as college town officials heard about the festival, I found myself being called in by officials who wanted to make sure that I was aware of what was going on, quote unquote, down there. And this is a reference to the neighborhood. Does housing know about this? The director of transportation asked me when I called on behalf of residents to request some of those large construction barrels to shut down the street that had divided the two neighborhoods. Somehow the police chief got wind of the festival planning and emailed me to alert me to the danger that I probably was not aware of was awaiting me in the neighborhood. He asked if I was aware of the constant feuding between residents in University Heights and Regal Gardens. That's the name that's given to the neighborhood. He wondered if there were plans in place for police security. I did not respond to the chief's message. Instead, I printed the message and shared it with Vanessa and her mother. Mr. Rita, whose whole family, including Vanessa's stepdad Darnell and little brothers Sammy and Michael, were all now involved with the planning. Vanessa said that she would include the chief's message on that week's festival planning meeting agenda. And by this time, the girls were rotating their leadership roles in terms of leading the meetings and doing the planning. At the festival planning meeting the following week, there was a hushed silence as Vanessa read aloud the police chief's email. Moments earlier, the room had been bustling with talk of games that would be best suited for different age ranges, a talent show to showcase neighborhood talent, and of course, food. The room was filled to capacity with an intergenerational group of community members, younger kids who were on task teams to organize the games, several of the girls' mothers, and Darnell. All were from Regal Gardens and University Heights, the two communities that the chief was warning me about in his email. After Vanessa had finished reading the chief's email, she spoke up first. "Who is he talking about?" she asked. Then her mother spoke. "Certainly not anyone in this room." Then came a deluge of voices, indignant that someone from outside could talk about the community in that way. I wondered aloud if the chief had been to the neighborhood at all. No, someone said. The police had been to the neighborhood perhaps 100 times, but never the police chief and never by the community's invitation. Everyone agreed that the chief should come to see for himself what people in the community were planning. I responded to the chief's email the next day with an invitation to meet with the planning team. The chief arrived in the neighborhood on a sunny September afternoon after he had first dispatched an unmarked patrol car to drive through the neighborhood. It was just after the kids got home from school. The community was filled with laughter as kids played in the street that meandered through the 1970s style brick apartments. The community organizing collective, which had grown to include more community members and girls, was gathered around the table at the center. At the table was Miss Naomi, Jade's and Chanel's aunt, Miss Lynetta, Tanya's mom, Moni, Naomi's 7-year-old daughter, Natalie, age 16, who was just joining the group, Jade, age 17, myself, and then Stacy, who was a wonderful collaborator who had worked as was in the community before I got there, and then Joaquin, I've mentioned earlier, he was at the table, and Joaquin was now back at the university as a first-year graduate student and continuing as an Ella Baker Women's Center volunteer. So the chief came in, and after everyone had introduced themselves, Miss Naomi began to tell him about our plans for the festival. As the chief stood before us, his gun protruded from his holster. 7-year-old Moni was standing beside him. She suddenly looked up at him and asked, "Why do you have a gun?" I think he said something about it being part of his uniform or something like that. But it was a statement that did some work in that moment. My sense was that the gun was out of place. This was a neighborhood, a community, a place different from what the police had probably imagined. After that, the police chief walked the neighborhood with the group, with Monty leading the way up the hill to the place where we would stage the festival. At that point, the chief had become part of the planning. He suggested ways to get the various sites for the games and understood finally that this was something the community wanted. To be sure, this was a momentary victory. The police chief was part of the process and participating in the creation of a different narrative about the community. But that is not what this story is primarily about. This story is about a route for communities to see their own power, even if it's momentary.
Dr. Parker, that story right there really resonates with me. I actually am glad, of course, that that festival was able to happen, because this happened before I became a member. And I remember going to the festival and meeting you there and some of the other girls. And that's when I actually was able to learn about the organization. So like I said, I'm glad that it happened. And I knew at that moment that I wanted to join and I wanted to be a part of an organization that focused on social justice and community building. So I'm so glad it turned out the way that it did, despite that event that occurred. So yes.
That is so great to hear. And yeah, that's really great.
What do you think we can learn about Ella Baker's philosophy from that story that you just told?
That's a great question. I mean, in the book, I have tables that correspond to each of the chapters. This chapter is about creating a space where people find their own individual roots to social justice, just as you did, and as the girls did in planning the festival. But there's another lesson in here that I think is a central lesson, and it is about it's a lesson about community building, and it's about people learning to work collectively to see their own power. So I think those are the two things: individual roots to creating that space for individual roots to collective consciousness, and then creating a space for collective power to emerge.
Okay, thank you. So for the last part of the conversation, I wanted to talk about parts of this work, like the challenging parts of doing this type of work. So I know you included in the book a section about activist self-care. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yes. Yes, and I'm actually there's the lot. It's actually the penultimate chapter. It's chapter 5, and I want to read. It is a book that is about activist self-care. So I'm going to start reading on page 122 of the book. Just give me a moment. And this book, this chapter is titled "Rewriting Ella Baker's Daybook." Integrating self-care and activist work. And this was something that came to me early in the process of documenting this work and thinking about writing the book. I was at the Schomburg and I was, going through the archives. And first of all, it was just so, it was like a spiritual experience, really, touching documents that were Miss Baker's her hand had written on, and one of those documents was her day book, and it just struck me that it sort of made real for me the intensity of the work that she did and the schedule that she kept. So I'm going to read this section. In fact, I'm going to start with the quotes and read a section here about integrating self-care and activist work. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Ella Baker, 1964. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Audre Lorde, 2006. The contents of Ella Baker's day book during her time as field secretary for the NAACP from 1940 to 1943 reveal a relentless and difficult travel schedule. She spent several months each year away from her home in Harlem, assisting branch leaders with membership drives, fundraising, and building local campaigns. Often she traveled alone throughout the Jim Crow South, typically by train or bus, where the unjust laws of segregation were sometimes enforced through harassment and violence. On at least 2 occasions, she resisted demands to leave a section of a dining car when it was clearly within her rights to remain there. Baker's day book also revealed an arduous itinerary of meetings and other engagements at which she navigated constantly within patriarchal circles that questioned her belonging. From early September to late November 1941, she delivered 63 speeches in 7 cities. In keeping with her developing philosophy, Baker also sought out as many opportunities as she could to create deeper connections with local people, sometimes spending as much as 2 weeks in a city, touring the region and learning about local issues and concerns. In 1943, Baker was named Director of Branches, signifying the important and massive work she had done and would continue to do, building up the NAACP's membership and catalyzing local people throughout the South to join the fight for their freedom. So I just wanted to give a bit of a flavor of the kind of schedule that Ms. Baker took. And now I want to skip over to some parts where I talk about how I came to understand self-care, because in reading Ms. Baker's day book and listening to her schedule, it leaves this question, leaves a question for me on the table, and I have this question. I don't attempt to answer it, but I do feel like it's important to have the question, and that question is, what was the emotional and psychological toll of all this? On this question of self-care, is Ella Baker's life a cautionary tale or a source of inspiration or some of both? And so that's what I try to do in this chapter. I just take fragments. I talked with lots of my activist friends and I include some of their voices in some of the fragments, including my own. And so I will, I also want to call attention to a section in the book in which I was able to engage with 2 wonderful arts activists. I had a chance to go to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in December, to study at the Center for the Theater of the Oppressed. And there, I was able to engage with 2 wonderful, I was able to engage with 2 wonderful activists. And this is, I want to name their names, Chanel Edwards and Ashley Davis. They were co-presenters. We presented part of my forthcoming, part of my work at that time in December 2019. The book wasn't yet published. And so I just want to call attention to that wonderful, and I reprinted the performance that Ashley did there. And there's also a video available that I'd like I'll share with others on our website. But as I reflected on this question of what is the toll and what is self-care, this is where I landed for myself. And that is, starting on page 126, I have come to understand self-care as ultimately care for the spirit of self and others. in that sense, a question for me that's important is, what would a daily practice of self-care involve? In 2011, I participated in a week-long Theater of the Oppressed workshop for educators. I was exhausted going into the workshop. As I recounted in this book, for 4 years, I had poured my heart into the emotional, intellectual, psychological, and physical labor of being in community with people across race, class, gendered, generational, and spatial boundaries. And here I list all the things that I did that supported that work. And I conclude that I quoted another activist, Cheryl Giltz. This is what it feels like to hold back the ocean with a broom. This is what she had described as Black women's community work. But that Theater of the Oppressed workshop that I participated in during late July felt like it freed the ocean for me, because it introduced me into a way of thinking about self-care, a daily practice of self-care. I have daily meditations. I've started to record those, and then I go back and listen to those recordings. I also create spaciousness and connections with others, other activists. And so again, social justice work for me is this perfecting process, not to be perfect, not to say that you're perfect in doing this work, but somehow perfecting your own capacity to do this work. And that begins in one's own life and extends to others. To me, that's key, having the connection of doing your work and connecting that to how you are engaging with others. And that's what I try to do every day.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. Now I think it's time for us to move into Q&A.
I was just coming on to do that. Thank you both so much for sharing during this time. There are a few questions in the chat that I hope that we can get to. So the first one is, do you think that Ella Baker's philosophy especially works well with youth, and why? I think, the Ella Baker Women's Center works with youth. You tell the story of the police chief with Moni leading the way and asking the most direct question. So maybe have philosophy and youth kind of work together.
I think absolutely her philosophy. And in fact, I could use her own words. I'm not sure if I'll be able to quote it, but Bernice Regan, who was with the founder, I believe, of Sweet Honey and the Rock, the group, who wrote Ella's song. And she wrote that song based on words from Miss Baker's speeches and so forth. And one of the excerpts from that song goes something like this: that youth are the ones who will lead the way, that they are strong when often some of the adults don't have the courage to be out in front and to do activist work. So I think she absolutely understood that youth are the vanguards of social justice change. So thank you for that question. I think that's really important, and it is the reason that I decided to start with teenagers, young people, in this activism.
Yeah, it makes me think about, you talk about the journey of self-care, and maybe how the more activism that you do, the more you realize you need it. The more you fight. So when you're young, that's why we look to the youth. Another question in the chat, I'm going to throw on screen. What are the biggest obstacles for academics who want to be deeply involved in communities outside of the university? And did Ella Baker like to work with professors, or were there social cultural obstacles? Thank you for that question, Lloyd.
Yes, thank you. I think that there are several obstacles, and I list them in the book. One of the main obstacles is the fact of the way the academy approaches working with people in communities. That is to say, the premise is often that we go into communities to help them to do something, to work on communities. Oftentimes there are studies on communities, or there are studies about communities, and that sort of mindset primes us to create this hierarchical distance. I will just make this confession that, in which I do in the book, even when we have an intentionality to be in partnership, and the reason for the partnership is because there is deep knowledge, a deep well of knowledge in communities. When you're talking about the challenges and the problems of, working towards social justice, the people who are living, this is a quote from Ms. Baker, people who are living under the heels of oppression should be the ones leading, which is to say, defining those problems and having a say about policies, for example, that are going to affect their lives. So we can go in with these intentions to work in partnership with people and to engage that knowledge, but there's something about the academic mindset that often will stand as an obstacle. And so part of what I've learned is to recognize that and to check it. And Ms. Baker's philosophy is wonderful in providing those checks. In terms of whether she worked with academics, Joanne Grant was one of her best friends, and she did the first documentary. Fundi is the first book, and well, maybe not the first book, but the first documentary that was made about Ella Baker's life. So she had great relationships, and with she had other associations, I think, with professors. It really wasn't about in fact, it was not about hierarchy. Like she felt like people from all walks of life are needed to think about this, building the kind of participatory democracy that we say we want to have in this country and also globally. She worked internationally as well. And so I'm not sure what's behind that question about whether she worked with academics, but the answer is yes. And I think she worked with people from all walks of life.
Yeah, I think so often we're just looking for that, practical advice on how to do this work, because it is so subjective, community to community, because you really have to come in with that open spirit to work with people where they're at. If there are any last questions from our audience, please throw them into the chat. While we wait for you to do that, I want to throw up the cover of Dr. Parker's book and tell you to please check it out. Here's some praise for the book. You can see we already knew it was wonderful because we got to hear a few pieces from it. But please get the whole book, and you can have this practical advice and this insight in what Baker was doing. And I don't see any other questions, so I guess I get the last question, which is a pleasure. And I think my last question is sort of, we're in this historic moment right now where we're sort of more separated than ever. We are doing conferences over Zoom. So many of us are struggling to find community. So what do you think are, what do we do now? How do we take Ella Baker into this moment? As we search for community and as we build it in this new way.
Yes. Well, Ashley, I think now more than ever, Ella Baker's philosophy and approach to community engagement is needed, it's necessary. And what we do now is gather. Social justice is about convening, getting the people in the room who need to talk with each other. I think, you talked about, maybe you were talking about just the separateness of being away from each other, but I think there's so much division, in our country right now. And I have a strong belief in getting the right people in the room to have conversations. And for Miss Baker's philosophy, the way that when she would go into a community, she was always looking for the person or persons who were already doing the work, who already had an analysis. You know, people have so many different responses to social conditions, right? And oppression and the way power and policing and over policing, so many different responses to that. Miss Baker was always looking for the ones who understood how power was circulating. And so I think that this is the opportunity in this moment for us to seek out those people in communities who understand what's happening and connect them, get them in rooms together and have a dialogue about how we grow that kind of collective consciousness about social justice and building the kind of democracy that we all want going forward.
Yeah. From your lips to God's ears, as they say. I think that's wonderful. Thank you both so much for sharing this book, and Ella Baker, and work with conversation and relationship with us. We really appreciate you. And to everyone out there, thank you for joining us. We hope that you'll stick with us. We have a few more events this week. We also have some of our previous events are online where you can watch those streams. Tomorrow we have a keynote panel on with Ann Helen Peterson and Patricia Parker. And then at 1 o'clock, we're actually going to be hearing from some different communities talking about how to connect with them, which is exactly what we've been talking about tonight. So both of those are great opportunities to dialogue more with the Humanities for the Public Good. And we hope to see you then. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Shawanna, for being here. It's just such a pleasure.